So, Passover's coming, and I've seen some interesting stuff, and I remember reading interesting stuff about what's really so much of what a religious person might do in their kitchen at Passover. We won't find in the text, and I find it super interesting that maybe 200 years ago people wouldn't have thrown their sacks of grain away. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why that happens when we're to get rid of the leaven, not necessarily something that has the possibility to become leaven.
Well, and actually, yeah. So we are commanded to remove hametz, and hametz literally means that which has leavened. That is to say, it's the thing that is leavened now. It has risen. That sounds almost theological, but the idea being that something that has risen already needs to be gotten rid of, and people would have absolutely kept in their house sacks of flour, sacks of raw grain, because those were necessary for continuing to make bread. And by bread, I mean matzah. Matzah is a type of bread. It is not the opposite of bread. And until the modern world where you can walk into a supermarket and buy a 5-pound box of ready-made matzah that will keep and not be spoiled throughout the entire holiday, most people would have handled their Passover cooking the same way they handled their rest of the year cooking, which is you made your bread day by day. You didn't make it in advance because, what if you made too much and then you wasted some? That's food. You don't have extra food. You only have barely enough food if you're lucky. So you would only make it as you needed it. And that meant you needed flour. And so everybody would have been expert at making their own matzah. And it was really partly the luxury of the modern world, modern manufacturing techniques, modern consumer economies that allow people to say, you know what? I don't feel like I'm an expert at doing this. And since it's already made, well, probably the first generation said, since it's already made, that's a lot less work. The same reason why people buy sliced bread generally rather than making their own bread. But over time, it's a lot less work also became it's a lot more certain. And I don't know whether you want to go into the whole notion of the creeping stringencies that come from a lack of security of understanding what the law is, or becoming more fearful about transgression rather than about fulfillment. But that psychology began to reinforce the notion that you should have nothing to do with anything that is made during this time of year, and that all of that should be handled by super experts rather than by knowledgeable individuals who have been properly educated in the ways of Judaism. Now, getting rid of bread, that is to say what most of us think of by bread, you've got a loaf of bread sitting on your countertop and Passover rolls around, absolutely. It is absolutely what we call hametz gamur. It is 100% hametz. It has risen and leavened and all that good stuff, and it's out the house. So that is the fulfillment of the text where it says no hametz will be found in your dwelling.
I was going to go somewhere. So I find it. You made a little joke about it is risen. It sounds almost theological. There's a very popular messianic teaching about matzah that you can buy from the store, and they'll say, well, look, it's got stripes on it just like the Messiah had stripes, and it's pierced just like I'm not kidding.
Okay, yeah,
it really happens. But
never heard of that. Wow,
it's true, and it's pierced just like the Messiah was pierced, but that only looks like that because it was factory made.
Correct.
So it just shows how modern. Well, it just shows actually how new to kind of Jewish tradition and items a lot of the Messianic audience is, because they don't understand that that's the result of the factory, and that the original matzah probably was something you could fold up like a mission wrap, like a tortilla bread.
A good way of putting it. And indeed, when we do the korach and the seder, the Hillel sandwich, as they say, it's called a korach, which is a wrap. That's kind of what the word means, and there is quite a bit of evidence that matzah that is homemade, and especially in the ancient way where it would have been made on ovens that were usually the outside conical type ovens that you put it on the outside, not inside, would have been soft-ish. They still would not have risen. There would have been no time for the leavening process to take place. But they also wouldn't have been baked so thoroughly and, homogeneously, that they were rigid all the way through, the way modern matzot are baked. So yes, they would not have needed all of those other things. So that's all the part of the manufacturing process.
We do, as an exercise and for fun, and because it's good, we make gluten-free ones during the Passover as a celebration, and we do them on a hot plate, and just make them up real quick and throw them on, and they're all good. The other thing I wanted to talk about were rice and peas.
The kitniyot. They're slightly different categories, but can sort of be covered roughly the same. So, for at least a short answer, the Rabbinical Assembly, through the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, which is the law committee that meets as part of the conservative movement, which provides more researched and formally constructed answers to some questions that are considered important for the entire movement rather than congregation by congregation. Just recently published additional information on the status of kitniyot. If you remind me at the end of this, I can send you the link and you can put the connection in. So kitniyot were prohibited primarily from the bean variety back in the day, that is to say a few hundred years ago, because they were used very similarly to flour. And I know that everybody thinks that when you look at flour, you see this beautiful white pristine powder, and when you would imagine grinding up beans to make a flour, it would be this sort of dark tan or brownish type mixture, and there'd be no way that you could possibly confuse the two. Well, two things. One, most flour before the modern time was not bleached, perfectly white, pristine looking flour. It was also a muddier color. Most flour that's made from the cheaper grains, and in antiquity, the barley grains and the rye grains and such, was a much deeper color than the wheat flour that we have today. And bean flour was commonly used. And it was commonly used in exactly the same way, and this is the kicker, as the other types of flour were used, the grain flours. And that meant that not only was there a chance that you might accidentally use one for the other and make a mistake, which, as we just talked about a second ago, people would have still had their sacks of flour in their house during Passover to make the matzah they needed day by day. But you would have also had your sacks of bean flour right in the same area, and the rules for cooking with bean flour are completely unlimited. There's no worry about hametz, there's no worry about the leavening, whereas the other one there is. And if you were to grab the wrong one, just by mistake, you could end up cooking the flour that came from grain in the manner that you had been cooking the bean flour, and bada bing, bada boom, you have violated the mitzvah, you have broken the commandment. So for the Eastern Europeans for whom this was a concern, they said, look, just don't have either. Don't have the beans at all. You still have to have the grain flour because you need to have matzah, or else you can't do the commandment. So you have to have matzah, grain flour, okay, but the bean flour, just put it away so you don't even get in the habit of cooking with a flour-like substance in a manner that could easily violate the commandment if you did it with the grain flour instead. And then, of course, the second part of it was when you have two substances that look really, really similar and used in similar ways, and you keep them in the same part of the house and you're scooping in and moving around, chances are you're also intermixing. Just a little. As someone in my pre-kosher days and youth worked in a Domino's pizza for making pizzas, I can tell you when things are rushed in a kitchen, or even when they're not so rushed, when you're picking up from one bin and you move your hands across the top of another bin, things drop. So that's going to happen. And whereas what's called bittul b'shishim, that things can be nullified by being a tiny percentage, is an important rule for keeping kosher in general, When it comes to hametz, when it comes to Passover, you don't get to do that. It has to be 100% hametz free, not just, I'm really pretty sure that there's no more than a speck. If you think there is a speck, you don't use it. So it was better, again, in those Ashkenazic worlds to just set it aside and not even enter it into the mix where you would possibly use it incorrectly.
But the Sephardics don't have a problem with it?
Nope. It was never a concern in their communities. And because it was never a concern in their communities, they never developed an internal stringency to avoid it. But again, also another long conversation about how what started off as a fairly straightforward and quite reasonable prohibition given the cooking methodology of those days eventually snowballed into a really complicated set of prohibitions and quite difficult set of rules to follow. And someday we'll have the long conversation of when is taking on a stringency that is unnecessary actually detrimental to spirituality. Because some stringencies are wonderful and they are very, very helpful. And they do help protect the commandments and they help strengthen the spirit. And some stringencies, not so much.
So it does feel like it's more about fences than actually following any kind of written command or mitzvah.
Those aren't exactly opposite. So a fence in and of itself makes a lot of sense. I mean, you can look at, there's a commandment to build a fence. It's called the parapet on the roof of the house. And I would be willing to wager that if you went to a park that had a big cliff, that had a lot of people coming through it, not just some random cliff in the middle of nowhere, but it was really one of the most scenic parts, lots of people coming in, taking their pictures, maybe a little crowding occasionally, you would like to have a fence, a little bit of a railing, near the edge of that cliff. Because you know that in the hustle and bustle of a lot of people doing a lot of things in this area, there's the potential that someone's going to slip. And that fence is there to protect the observance. It's not there to replace the observance. What happens is when the fence moves so far back from the edge of the cliff that you can no longer see the cliff. And if you have the fence back in the parking lot, then you prevent people from reaching the cliff to understand why they have the fence there, what they are supposed to be viewing, what they're supposed to be experiencing, the awe from the natural wonder, and etc. So there is absolutely every reason for certain precautionary steps in order to prevent transgressions. But that is a very delicate balance, and more is not always better.
And finally, the act of, and I might not put this one in because if you don't really sell it to me, I don't want to make people annoyed by it the way I'm annoyed by it. The idea of selling things from your house to a Gentile, knowing that you're going to buy it back. I get the concept of it, but it seems like a big lie.
Okay.
It's like, the police are going to raid your house and you have something illegal, so you give it to a neighbor and then they give it back after the police have come, but you still get arrested, and then in court you say, well, it wasn't in my possession at the time. The jury aren't going to say, oh, it wasn't? Don't worry about it then. You can go home. They're going to say, yeah, but you knew it was yours. So can you give me your, like I said, if
give you my sales pitch for the sale.
Sure, and if I think it's going to be detrimental to people, I won't put it in.
So yeah, it's prefaced on an understanding of what it means that something has hametz. So the usual idea is exactly as you described, that I'm imagining that when I say I have hametz in my house, it's a giant loaf of bread sitting on my countertop. And I'm going to sell the loaf of bread, but really all I'm going to do is stick it in a box and put it in my cupboard and tape it up, and I won't eat it during Passover, but I will say it belongs to someone else because we went through a legal fiction of transferring ownership in this temporary way. And I agree that when it comes to things like that, where I'm just selling it because it's easier than getting rid of it, or I don't really want to lose it, or whatever, that it's very easy to see how that would feel wrong. Hametz is more problematic than a loaf of bread. When you are keeping kashrut, and when you understand it in the ways that our sages have understood it for more than 2,000 years, hametz becomes penetrated into many of your utensils and items and surfaces, and much of it we can kasher, we can get rid of, we can expel, but a lot of it you just can't. So, classic example, if you have a toaster, the little thing with slots, you push down and then the bread goes in, it gets hot, it comes up. There is no way to make that kosher for Passover. It is physically impossible. You would have to disassemble the entire box, and you would have to take out all the electronic components and scrub them individually, find some way to heat them to expel the parts they might have absorbed, and take the rest of it and dunk it in boiling water and try and put it back together again, and lo and behold, your toaster's broken. So you would have to get rid of your toaster every single year if you were going to do this. Most types of porcelain or china type dishes that don't have particular types of sealants on them, there is no way. They're considered to be like pottery. There's no way for them to expel the hametz that they have absorbed during the year, which means you would have to get rid of all those dishes every single year. And so what you're selling are the embedded particles of hametz in things that cannot be removed, in things that cannot have the koshering process be done to them. And the alternative would be to get rid of it. Now, why is this a modern problem rather than an ancient problem? So why did it become more common? It's because we have more stuff. 300 years ago, the only person who had to worry about hametz things that they couldn't afford to get rid of was the baker, who had these giant machines or ovens or molds that he couldn't just get rid of every single year. That was his business. They were huge investments. And so he would sell the hametz that was embedded in them to someone else in order that he could be able to fulfill the mitzvah. But most other people, they didn't have anything more than a few wooden plates, and that's fairly easy to kosher. And a couple pots, also very easy to kosher, and metal pots and such. There was no reason to need this for the average household. We are now awash in stuff, and if you don't sell it, then that means you're keeping it, and keeping it legally as yours. So this is the compromise between having a modern material existence, where we don't live like peasants from the 10th century, but we also don't ignore the fact that what's in those items is hametz, and therefore it needs to be out of our possession.
But does the text say that you shouldn't own it, or it shouldn't be in your house?
Yes.
I knew that was coming.
Yeah.
It's just, surely you can just give it to someone to look after. What isn't that? Couldn't you do that rather than selling it?
No. Well, first of all, the alternative that you're describing, which is I box up all of the things in my house that possibly have hametz that I can't get rid of, or I'm not going to get rid of the hametz from inside of them because I don't need it during Passover. I put it in a box and I give it to my neighbor who's not Jewish. It's still mine. The ownership is still mine, even though it's in their house.
And it's the ownership that's the issue rather than where it is.
Correct. And to be fair, that's quite true. If your friend loans you their car and they park it in your garage, it doesn't become your car. It's still their car. It just happens to be in your garage, and vice versa. If you take your car and park it in their garage, they don't suddenly take ownership of it. There's a transfer of ownership that's more important than location.
Has there ever been a case, and this is a silly question, I know, that someone's been, they've bought this amazing china set for $1 and then they haven't given it back because they made a legal sale? I'm just curious. I can see that happening.
The real case that I have read about that someone wrote to the rabbi to try and get more information on was they had done the sale of hametz for a lot of their appliances and things, their bread maker, for example, and their garage was broken into, and someone stole all these things. And they had to ask, am I allowed to tell my insurance company that these things were sold because I had sold the hametz? And therefore, can I claim them on my insurance policy because they weren't really mine? And as that rabbi explained, and I think he was perfectly right, when you do the sale of hametz, you're selling the hametz. You're not selling the item that contains the hametz. So somebody who buys the china set isn't actually buying the china set. They are buying the hametz in the china set that they now own. So if they would like to try and find a way to get the hametz out without destroying the china set, they are absolutely welcome to have that. But they don't get the china itself.
I feel there's a whole new layer of lawyering that could spring up around that. That's very interesting. Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you very much.
So, yeah, you can decide whether or not you think piecing that together is going to make people happy or even more furious. But I will tell you personally, because I've gone through a long journey myself of where I've come into my own understanding of observance and practice. This used to bug me too, for exactly the reasons you're describing. It sounds like a legal loophole. It sounds like you're just dodging the mitzvah. It doesn't sound right. It doesn't feel right until you also, pardon the pun, absorb the underlying way that we understand kashrut, of how things absorb the substances that have been cooked in them. Once that becomes a normal part of your way of looking at items and food and things around you from regular day-to-day kashrut, then this makes perfect sense. Because otherwise, every Passover would be a catastrophe. You would just be destroying it all. My wife's family actually says that there was a Jewish hotel in Bournemouth when they were younger, way back in the day, that indeed did not do the sale of hametz. I don't know why, because this was just what they said, and they would take and literally throw out all of the dishes every year that couldn't be koshered. And it was considered just an enormous and massive waste. And you were throwing out all of the dishes because of the specks of hametz that were embedded in them. And I think this shows the wonderful balance within Jewish law, that there are ways to find solutions to the tensions that crop up from time to time as our lifestyles continue to change. Doesn't mean you always get to do what you want. Doesn't mean that there's always an excuse to just do what you feel like. But it does mean that Torah, generally speaking, is never going to introduce greater suffering on a person or a society, as long as it's being studied and understood in all of its depths.